Today's text comes from Matthew 16, verses 21 through 28. Hear the word of the Lord. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Then Jesus told his disciples, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who want to lose their life for my sake will find it. For what does it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is come with his angels in glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in the kingdom." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. As we reflect on these words here in Matthew, we find ourselves focused on different things. Some are human issues and some are divine issues. And yet so much of our consciousness, our thought process, our ways of doing and reflecting upon life are simply not in tandem with God's priorities. I'm not talking about issues of living the realities of the gospel in the world. Jesus' teaching, the bulk of his ministry was focused on living out the principles of the gospel in the day-to-day. No, rather, Jesus is talking about divine issues versus human concerns. Not so much the application of the gospel, but exchanging the gospel, the good news, a radical new understanding of God's reign on earth, for the ways of doing and being in the human dimension. Our thoughts, attitudes, and actions too often run contrary to God's purposes, and we relegate God's will and God's design to some secondary issue of our existence. Do we become adversaries to God by failure of linking our lives and attitudes and thought processes to the priorities God has for us? Unsurprisingly, Peter stuck his foot in his mouth again. Throughout the Gospels, we find this a normal routine. Peter is the spokesman, the front man for the 12. And if anything needs to be addressed or brought to Jesus' attention, Peter is the first one to speak. But normally what he shares is simply what is on the heart and mind of all the disciples. It is not Peter alone. Yet Peter is the one who opens his mouth first. So he gets the lion's share of the blame for being the one to speak before thinking. Peter had understood Messiah all his life to be God's chosen one to come and bring about a wholesale change in the life of Israel. Messiah was to come and set things right. He was to usher in a golden age for Israel on the world stage, where all the nations would come to seek the leading affirmation and direction from Yahweh's Messiah, who would usher in peace, not for Israel alone, but through Israel to bless all the world. It would be the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham so long ago that all the nations of the world would be blessed through him and his seed. So when Jesus started talking about him needing to be killed, to suffer, to be tortured by the leaders in Jerusalem, the religio-political establishment among his own people who were yearning for the coming of Messiah, Peter was at a loss and felt the need to call Jesus aside and correct his thinking. So he pulls Jesus aside to correct him one-on-one, saying, this could never be. God could not, should not ever allow such a thing to occur. You see, Peter was looking for a standoff between Messiah and the powers of the world, something akin to Elijah facing down 450 prophets of Baal, plus 400 prophets of Asherah. Elijah alone against this multitude of opposing voices and demonstrating with finality the reality of Yahweh's presence and action and redemption. He was expecting something akin to Gideon's story of victory over innumerable foes, while Gideon simply stood with a pitcher and a torch, a trumpet blowing and heralding the presence of God and allowing God to fight the battles, but Gideon being the primary vessel, ushering in and harbinging God's presence. Peter was expecting some major confrontation such as these, to see the Roman forces running off as the Assyrians, hearing a noise during the night and believing their enemies to be too numerous against whom they could not do battle. Some great intervention of God through Messiah that would usher in the new age. And here was Jesus talking about being tortured, vilified, cast aside, discarded, and killed by Peter's own countrymen. The leaders, religious and political, of the Jews, turning against Jesus, Peter, and the disciples' hope that Messiah would inaugurate God's reign at last. Jesus turned to Peter and said, "No, Peter. Peter, you are acting as a stumbling block to me. You are opposing me as though you were the head of all opposition. You have become my adversary." The Hebrew Scriptures never developed the concept that we deal with so often of having Satan or the devil as prince among all those opposing God. But the New Testament at least accepts the personification of all the powers, human and otherwise, arrayed against God, as summed up using the Hebrew term Satan, which is simply adversary, or its Greek equivalent, devil. or one of numerous other terms that were being bandied about in Jesus' day. Beelzebub. And he turns to Peter and says, your attitude, your mindset right now is that of all my opposition as God's emissary. You have your mind stuck on things human, on issues political, on issues where the world around you does not bend and will not accept God's plan and purpose. Rather than think according to the designs of the world in opposition to God, you need a change of thought process. You need to think again and place your vision and your focus upon God's design, not the designs of this world, not things of human origin, but the design in God's plan for grace and a different kind of rain. We hear these words and we see Peter and we want to castigate Peter as being foolish in trying to stand up to Jesus and Jesus' plan. We see Peter easily as head of the other disciples and spokesman or front person for their own anxieties and worries. But Peter in the gospel plays another role as well. He is our representative. He speaks the things that we so often want to say when we encounter Jesus and Jesus' plan. Why should it be necessary for Jesus as Messiah, as Son of Man or Son of God to come and suffer and die? Shouldn't there be some other way for grace and acceptance and love and mercy to be carried through to fruition? If God's point and purpose is reconciliation, why must Christ suffer the brunt of human sin, of human anxiety, of human uncertainty, of human doubt, of fear, arrayed against the very purposes of God? Why? This could never be. This should never be, is our cry along with Peter. And yet Jesus turns to us saying, that is human thinking. That is worldly thinking. That is something other than divine focus, divine understanding, divine thinking. For human thought and human focus and human perceptions are antithetical to God's will and way and purpose. We don't have to look very far to see that. We can find political establishments in this world going back to the very beginnings of human history and see that they are antithetical to God's purposes of loving all, of redeeming all, of bringing all into the fullness of grace, in offering provision for everyone without discrimination, of expanding borders, of expanding definitions of who is welcome, of who is family, of who is called to participate in what we deem the family of God, the children of God, of who is acceptable under grace, mercy, and compassion. Now, Peter was suffering the very same delusions that we suffer. We still battle today to put ideas from the political stage, from our economic lives, from our social structures, front and center ahead of God's principles of love and grace. We still want to shine forth as prominent examples of those who have arrived according to the decrees and the descriptions and definitions of our social order. While Christ calls us to a life of giving instead of receiving. While Jesus calls us to belonging to God and extending God's offer of grace, despite what the world might throw at us. He turns from Peter and turns to the 11 and says, "You have the opportunity. You who have followed me now for 3 years. You whom I have charged with maintaining the core of my teaching, of remembering my ministry, of carrying on in my name after I am gone. You have the opportunity to become my disciples." Become. These were good men. These were good people. These were those of Jesus' innermost circle who had clung to him through thick and thin. Yet Jesus recognizes that they were still not fully and truly his disciples. They were still struggling between their allegiance to worldly thinking, to political and economic and social definitions of what was important, while Jesus called them to elevate their eyes to see what God deemed as primary for themselves, as the mission for them to fulfill. We struggle with the very same things, do we not? So often I have heard people tell me that, oh, the gospel is great and that will be wonderful when it comes to fruition on the other side of death in what we call the heavenly sphere. A heavenly realm where God reigns perfectly and people follow. And yet the words of Jesus tell us to enact God's reign here on earth right now. They call us through Jesus' example, through his teaching, through his challenge to the very disciples who tried to follow him, to put others first now. There is no waiting until some other time when it will be acceptable to truly love one another. There's no waiting period so that in some other reality of existence we might finally live according to mercy and compassion and justice. There is no waiting for an approved time when violence might be eradicated from our lives and actions and attitudes. There is no waiting for some other reality in which we might finally embrace that the charge upon us is worthy even if we should suffer for it. Jesus was not calling the disciples to be crucified alongside him. He was calling them to embrace that God's will and purpose We're antithetical and remain antithetical to the political, social, and economic purposes in the world around them and us. Christ died that we all might belong to one another, siblings all, sharing in the bounty that God has provided, offering grace and mercy, compassion, and the justice of having everyone's needs met without distinction. Beyond definitions of nationality, of race, of special identity or belonging to any one group. And until we can embrace that mentality, that attitude, that concept that Jesus was trying to transmit, we stand with Peter, embracing an adversarial role to God's purposes. Is it not time to rethink our lives, the focus of our living, that we might embrace God's purposes fully and wholly, aligning them into every aspect of our living, religious, political, economic, social, that God might rule in our lives and so transform the world around us as we become the disciples we have claimed to be.